Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our Threatened Species webinar this evening. It's a little bit chilly here in the Blue Mountains on Durroog and Gundungurra country in New South Wales. We are having some frosts, which is not all that usual anymore, but it's quite nice to see. Um, I'm coming to you from Invertebrates Australia tonight. Invertebrates Australia is a charity that aims to improve conservation outcomes for invertebrates across the country, and we're dedicated to looking after the little guys that help run the country. So tonight I'm really delighted to be joined by two panelists, so James Tallant and Jess Marsh. I'll let James and Jess introduce themselves one after the other. And then we'll start talking all about threatened species and how we can help our little Aussie invertebrates. James, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and good evening, everybody. My name is James Tallant. I'm joining you from Parramatta, Darug country in Western Sydney. And I work for a consultancy called EcoShore. And one of the things I do with EcoShore is I run quite a lot of training workshops in the IUCN Red List. And I've got a bit of a background in national Red List processes and things like that.
Thanks, James. It's wonderful to have you joining us. Thanks for spending the evening with us. And Jess.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming along tonight. It's great to see you all. So my name's Jess Marsh. I'm calling in from Kangaroo Island. And there are several Indigenous peoples who have long and enduring connections to Kangaroo Island, including the Raminjeri, Ngarrindjeri, and Kaurna peoples. I am a researcher at the University of Adelaide, and I work in conservation biology and taxonomy, mainly on spiders.
Thanks, Jess. And I should probably also introduce myself. So I'm Managing Director of Invertebrates Australia, and I'm also researcher, an associate professor at Western Sydney University, where I work on invertebrate conservation. All right, so we talk a lot about threatened species, don't we? It's in the news, this thing's endangered or that thing's endangered. It's vulnerable, things are critically endangered. And sometimes they've got other names too. Can't think of it off the top of my head, but various different types of legislation categorize species in different ways using different terminology. So what we're going to start off with tonight is just really trying to kind of unpack that a little bit. What does it actually mean to be a threatened species? And how does a species become a threatened species? And how does it stop being a threatened species? And those kinds of things. If you do have any questions, please pop your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them as we go. And we might be able to take a few questions at the end. So James, I just wondered if you wanted to quickly start off on that with your red listing experience. So people have heard of the IUCN Red List, I think, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they have this thing called the Red List of Species. And it's probably worth people knowing they also have something called the Red List of Ecosystems and the Green List of Species. And there's they're list makers, the IUCN. Could you give us a little bit of a background on the IUCN threatened categories and non-threatened categories and how the process kind of happens from when someone thinks that a species might be in trouble to actually being formally listed on the IUCN Red List?
Yeah, absolutely. So IUCN it's an intergovernmental organization. So it's not really a government body. It's not an NGO. It's a more like a UN agency or something like that. And the Red List is probably the most high profile thing that IUCN does. You hear about it in the media. If you go to zoos or aquaria, you would see the things about the Red List in there. But it's also commonly misunderstood. I think people sometimes feel that if a species is on the Red List, that automatically means it's in big trouble, but that's not necessarily the case. Really, it's just a tool for taking all of the information that we have about a species and then putting it through this system of criteria and thresholds and things. And then at the end, it comes out with basically a decision about what category something falls into. So you take all your data, you put it through the system, and you come out with a category. And that category could be least concern, which means that the species isn't particularly at a risk of extinction, or it could be extinct in the wild or extinct. Obviously, the situation is really bad. But when we talk about a threatened species, what we're really saying is that it falls into one of the threatened categories. So that's vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So threatened is just a bit of an umbrella term that applies to those three categories.
You're on mute, Kate.
Thanks, James. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, Jess, would you like to add to that?
So James mentioned about the IUCN Red List, which is one mechanism for assessing if a species is threatened in Australia. We also have parallel systems working through the EPBC Act, which is the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. I always forget that one. And that is one that the Australian government runs. So that is more of a kind of, it's a tool for legislation to assign a species as threatened, and then it gets prioritised for funding and resources as part of that. And each of the states and territories have their own systems for prioritising these species in terms of extinction risk.
Yeah, so we sort of have this system where how does the species get onto these lists though? I mean, how they don't, like, I think before I worked in conservation, I kind of imagined that somebody was checking on all of the species and making sure everybody was, had their conservation assessment organized, and yes, we know for sure who should and shouldn't be on the list. Is that even remotely the case?
Often not. No, it's. I mean, in the case of IUCN, because it's an international organization, people often think that they've got this huge team of people all typing away at red list assessments, but that's not the case at all. Really, anyone can write a red list assessment if you've got data on the species, and you do need to have data on the whole distribution of the species. So, but for some species, that might be quite a small area. If you've got data on a species, then you can at least contribute to, if not write the whole assessment yourself. We have these the Species Survival Commission is this global kind of expert volunteer network, which is split into different specialist groups. So if you're interested in a particular taxonomic group, then the chances are there's an expert group out there that you could join, and then you could contribute to these assessments. Obviously, the process at the national or state or territory scale is a little bit different, but it uses a lot of the same information.
Yeah, Jess, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I have, so part of my work, so I'm a co-founder and conservation lead in Inverts Australia, and part of my role in that position is to try and really drive forward assessments of Australia's invertebrates, because typically with our invertebrates, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, so we don't know that much about many of them. And this has meant that they can be overlooked for prioritizations in terms of funding. So they're often ignored. It's easier to ignore things if they're not listed. So as part of my role, it's really, as James says, you gathering information as much as you can about a species to try and work out where it is existing, what's threatening it, and different elements of its population, life cycle, etc. It's a really interesting process to go through, and it makes you get quite well acquainted with different species. You get to know a lot about them. But it is something that I think is really important. And although it's a sad thing to have a species listed because that means it's at threat, it's also, I think, a really positive thing because it's an acknowledgement that it's at threat, and it then means that we can work out ways to protect it.
Unfortunately, it sometimes becomes a bit of a political issue when species are added to these lists, or their status is uplisted to more endangered or something, critically endangered, for example. But I think it shouldn't really be seen as that. It's if something genuinely is at an extreme risk of extinction, it's much better that we know about it. it's if that's really what's going on, then that's when you can do something about it.
Yeah, that's right. So we both sort of said, anyone can nominate a species for one of these lists to be considered either by one of the specialist groups or one of the threatened species scientific committees for different governments in Australia. But do we see a bias in which kinds of species are nominated and who they're being nominated by? Jess, do you want to jump in on that one first up?
Yeah, sure. So there's absolutely a bias in state EPBC Act, which is the federal government, and the Red List in terms of a favour towards vertebrate species. Mammals in particular and birds are quite well represented on those lists. People can, so the main barriers really to invertebrates getting up there and to people working together to submit nominations is really that lack of data and trying to find enough information that, you may believe that the species you're working on is imperiled, is struggling, but actually getting enough data to formally classify it as threatened under the processes that the IUCN Red List and the state and federal government use is actually, it can be quite challenging, but it's something that everyone, if there's a species that people know that they're concerned about, there are ways through citizen science data, for example, to really gather information about that species that help with these assessments.
Yeah, it's what are the most important kinds of data? There's 5 main categories, 5 main criteria that we sort of typically use to assess species and whether or not they're threatened with extinction. And I think I'm right in saying, and I'd like to know your opinions about this, that we typically use the first 2 of those, and the most commonly used, the sort of population decline, how many individuals are there, and how much change has there been in the number of individuals, particularly sexually mature individuals that are breeding and all that kind of stuff. That's sort of the first criterion that we use a lot. And then the second criterion is around how much space species occupies, and what size area they use in the landscape, and how many of those there are, how big they are, and how kind of vulnerable they are to different threats. So if we're thinking about kind of the numbers of individuals or the area that species kind of occupy, what kind of data are the most important data when we're trying to understand whether species are threatened or not?
Yeah, so the categories and criteria for the Red List were kind of developed in a way that whatever data you have available, you can use it. Obviously, for the obvious thing is your kind of population data, how many of them are out there, and how is that number changing. But for lots of species and lots of invertebrates, that's just not realistic. You're not likely to know, even to the nearest 1,000, how many of some ant species there is, or something like, just for example. It's just not really plausible. For your large mammals and things like that, that might be a bit more realistic. And so that does limit a little bit the data that you can use when you're doing some of these assessments. But there's other things you can use. So you've got your spatial data you mentioned. Obviously, we talk about range, but when we're doing Red List assessments, there's some slightly different measures that we can use to calculate these things. So even just kind of an occurrence data or some habitat preference information, that can be very useful. And then also things to do with the threats, what threats are impacting on your species, because if you know it's even approximate habitat requirements, and you know where that kind of habitat is found, and you know that some of the likely threats that are impacting it, maybe it's invasive species or something like that that's the major threat, then you can use that together to put together an assessment. even if you don't know how many of them are out there, you can still say some quite useful things about, you know, where it is and is its habitat declining and what kind of threats are likely to be out there. So really, whatever data you have, you can use it. It doesn't matter if you don't know exactly what the population size is, for example.
Yeah, and I think that one's a really kind of common misunderstanding, that folks sometimes think that species have to be rare to be endangered, but that's not necessarily
Yeah.
the case.
Oh, that's right. You could have a species which is quite abundant. It's, you know, you can see it in quite large numbers. But if it's had a massive decline, it used to be even greater, then that might be enough for it to be considered threatened.
Jess, you've love you to jump in here as well. And also, I mean, I know you're working on a species where you can definitely count how many there are. So you're in a bit of a different situation. But yeah, what would you like to add to?
Yeah, so my focus, so I mentioned at the beginning, I work mixed taxonomy and conservation biology, and taxonomy is the naming and describing of species. So basically the questions that really interest me are what species we've got, where they are, and what's threatening them. And so mixing taxonomy and conservation biology together. And a lot of the species that I work on are highly range restricted. So they're ones that are only found in very, very small areas. Perhaps the epitome of that is a cave invertebrate. So a lot of my work I do in caves, and there we find whole species that are confined to a single cave. And so when you're dealing with species like that, so what we use is the second criterion, which and the categories and criteria that you use to assess species, and that one's based on geographical range and threats to that range. And so you can say, look, this species has got a really small distribution. We know, so good example, if I take a step back, is the Kangaroo Island assassin spider, which I work on. That has a very small distribution, and in 2020, all of its known range was burnt under high severity fire. Now, we didn't know how many individuals were there. We didn't know much about the spider. It's a very rare animal, yet we could assess it under the EPBC Act and the IUCN Red List because we knew that it was from a very small distribution and that fire had severely impacted its habitat, degrading the habitat quality and meaning that it was likely threatened. So there are ways around that you can work around gaps in knowledge to kind of assess species. And certainly for me, with the groups I work on, as I said, it's that having really small ranges and very clearly defined threats to those ranges and to that habitat is very important for getting around gaps in knowledge about exactly how many animals you've got out there.
Yeah, and I think I might be sharing a photo of the assassin spider at the moment with it carrying.
Oh,
Yeah, I can see it.
I can't.
Spidery prey. It's a great.
Yeah, so the Kangaroo Island assassin spider is the most remarkable species. It's as you can see by the image, it's a very odd looking spider. It's not like your typical spider. It's got a very elevated head region and really long chelicerae jaws. So its other name is a pelican spider. And these, as I mentioned, they were in 2019, their entire known range was impacted by fire. We managed to find some living individuals 4 kilometers from the known site, and that currently the site that they're in now, that broad patch is the only place the species is known. There was a question about having a favorite threatened species, and I think for me, this species has to be up there amongst. It's very difficult to choose a favorite, very difficult. But this species, from a human or from an emotional perspective, I have a lot of feelings for it because I remember that first moment when I found we thought the species might be extinct, and I found a female after the fires. It was after months of searching in the rain. And I think that emotional connection with invertebrates is not a very common thing. I think a lot of people have that connection with mammals or with, I guess, larger species that you can kind of relate to in a human way because they're fluffy or cute, or they blink and make noises, and you can kind of relate to them. But I think with this species, that feeling I had when I saw it alive, when I saw this female, was just huge. And I think with threatened invertebrate species, you know, they're underrepresented on threatened species lists. And I think one of the most important things for me in getting more species listed and more recognition for threatened species is to try and show people that these animals are really, they're important, that they're valuable, and that we need to care for them. And I think getting that representation increased just means that we're more able to find more assassin spiders, or, you know, go out and prevent further decline for other species.
It's a great story, that story of finding that female.
It was like seeing a celebrity. I'm not into celebrities, but I was like, whoa, you're here. Yeah.
It's a huge deal. I mean, you know, when do you stop searching for something that you think might be extinct? And it's a really kind of profound question, I think, and that you persisted and continued is great.
Very stubborn. It's like a
well, I didn't say that. I actually, it makes me want to tell the story of a species that I've been working on for a long time that people may know, have seen before. I'll just quickly share my screen to see, so you can see this critter, which is a thermocoloured grasshopper, or a chameleon skyhopper, and it's only found on the Kosciuszko Plateau, so it's only found on the various highest parts of Kosciuszko in New South Wales, and it has this amazing colour change where it turns turquoise when it heats up, and the males fight each other for females, and they're the only grasshoppers in the world known to do that, you know, and the only grasshoppers to change colour and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of have the opposite feeling when I look at this, Jess, because when I look at this creature, I think the Alps are going to be, you know, like if we continue on the current trajectory of climate change and average temperature increases and everything, the Alps are probably going to be snow-free year-round in Australia in like around 2070, which I may be alive to see, and certainly my children will be. And the irony for this species is that with global warming, they're more susceptible to freezing, because if we don't get good snowpacks in the mountains, their eggs won't survive over winter, and because they'll freeze, because they'll be exposed to the cold temperatures instead of being cozy under a snowpack. And so the problem with that is that all the adults die at the end of autumn. So the entire species is eggs all winter, and those eggs have to make it to spring in order for the species to continue. So when I look at this and I think about climate change and I think about our tiny little short mountains, I get this kind of profound sense of like the incredible loss of these beautiful, amazing little unique critters. And like I was saying before, when you go up to the mountains and you go walking in Kosci in summer, there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of these guys around. So it would be easy to make the mistake to think that they're okay, because they have this critical vulnerable part in their life cycle that could be kind of game over for the species. Yeah, it certainly makes me think twice about flying somewhere, that's for sure. So yeah, so Jess, you mentioned before that you like to mix taxonomy and conservation biology, and I think it's possibly a rather uncommon combination, at least historically. And it made me think about, what do we do about all the species that don't have names? So most people probably are aware that if a species doesn't have a name, we can't list it anywhere, we can't assess it. So Jess, could you give us a bit of a background on kind of the size of the problem there?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if most people know or not, but most invertebrate species are not yet described, not yet known to Western science. So we estimate that there's around 320,000 invertebrate species in Australia, and only a third of those are described. So we're talking about most species not having a name, not being described, not being able to be protected under current conservation legislation. Now, this is really important. So a study I was involved with earlier this year found that, so we estimated the number of extinctions since European arrival, and the estimated the number of species going extinct moving forward. And what we found was incredibly high numbers. So we estimated that around 9,000 invertebrate species have been lost since European arrival in Australia, and that we estimate between 1 to 3 species are likely going extinct each week. Now, this is exceptionally high. It's likely that most of these species are in that group that are not yet described, not yet known. And it's a huge problem when the current mechanism, the main way to work out where conservation funding is allocated is species level conservation assessments, where you need, we explained earlier that you need a lot of data to get a species listed. You need to know where it is, you need to work out a lot about it. And so there's the vast majority of, not vast majority, 2/3 of invertebrate species are not able to be protected under the current main mechanism for allocating resources. And I think we need to really try and focus on ways to link in species level protection, which is really important for those species that we can assess and list under threatened species listings. But we also need to work out ways to protect the unknown. And that, I think, means habitat protection, working out where those areas are of importance for invertebrates are, and really trying to protect them. But it is the scale of the problem is huge. The implications for that level of loss are highly complex. It's very difficult to predict what the impacts to us as humans and to our natural world may be, but the potential for catastrophic harm to ecosystems or farming or our way of life is I wouldn't say high, but there's certainly potential for things to impact us. And so, yeah, I think it's a really important, certainly something that drives me is trying to work out ways that we can protect those unknowns.
Yeah,
I think Jess, your answer is actually relevant to one of the things we've got in the Q&A. There's a little segue. There's a question from Carl Ramirez, which is asking about if there's been any assessments of kind of keystone species, that if you protect this species, then it kind of has an impact on lots of others. And there may well have been. I'm not actually aware of a paper on that kind of thing. It sounds like something that people have probably thought about, but it's certainly true that we've got all this huge number of undescribed species, which may well be as just as much at risk of extinction as species that have been described. And so if we look at some of our protected areas and things, or some of our parts of the country that have particular high biodiversity, then some of the investment, some of the work that you can do to protect the things that we do know about is actually going to probably, as a kind of a side effect, be protecting things that we haven't described. So it's yeah, I thought that was probably relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So when we're thinking about kind of being aware that we have to go on with conservation, knowing that there's a lot of unknowns, and we have to do our best to protect as much as we can. We have a bunch of different mechanisms. So we have these species by species mechanisms, and we have about 1,000 species, invertebrate species, that are listed either on the red list or some of the Australian legislative lists, that are threatened with extinction. I think the actual number is something like 945. But if you consider that 2/3 of invertebrates haven't even been described, rounding it up to 1,000 seems reasonable. So we have this really large number of threatened invertebrates in the country, and we have kind of all different ways that we can hero those species and get people on board helping to look after those individual species. But there's also these other mechanisms around red listing and conserving ecosystems, which and most maybe some people on the call have heard of the Global Biodiversity Framework, with this kind of international agreement that nations will meet certain, biodiversity goals by 2030. One of those, which does get talked about a little bit in the media, is this so-called 30 by 30 goal, where nations have pledged to protect 30% of their land and sea by 2030. And when we're thinking about all these unnamed invertebrates and countless named invertebrates that we can't get onto the lists because we either don't know enough about them or nobody's put them forward yet, or whatever the case may be, as to why they're not there, strikes me that one way we could, potentially protect lots of invertebrates is to designate really important places for invertebrate diversity. Jess, do you want to talk a little bit about how we might find out where those places are in Australia, what's been happening so far, and maybe if you wanted to talk about either your bushfire, like the bushfire work, or whatever you want to say, go for it.
We know that there are areas of importance for invertebrates. So often where you get an invertebrate species that has a very small range and it's only found in one particular habitat in an area, it's likely and often the other species also are restricted to that range and that area and that habitat. And so you in effect get areas where you get whole groups of species restricted to those single areas, and we call them short-range endemic species. We also know that for species with wider ranges, there are habitats or areas that are particularly important for invertebrate biodiversity, either because they're important breeding habitats or overwintering sites. And if we can work out where these areas of importance are, then we can put into place measures to protect them and effectively protect quite a few species by just looking after that one area. One of the so I live on Kangaroo Island, and a lot of my work is based on the invertebrate species that we have here. And I mentioned earlier that during the fires, the Kangaroo Island assassin spider, its whole known range, was impacted. But in that area that the Kangaroo Island assassin spiders found in the northwest of Kangaroo Island, we also know of a whole raft of other invertebrate species, most of which are not yet described, but that are only restricted to that area. The reason it's such an important area for biodiversity is that it's like an island within an island. So it's a little high rainfall area in the northwest. The rest of the island's quite dry, but this area has a lot more water. It's got really nice creek lines. It's got some beautiful, beautiful old country and old vegetation. And so what's happened as Australia dried up, then we've got these species that are now trapped in this island effectively. And that means that, for one, it's really important for biodiversity because we've got species found there that are found nowhere else. If it goes, they all go. But it also means that we can then focus our resources on looking after that area and trying to protect it, which is what we're working towards. And so if we can apply that, it's a big task, but if we can apply that more broadly in Australia and work out where similar areas are, then that's a really nice way of protecting what we know, but also protecting all of those species that are likely just as in peril, just as at risk of extinction as our known listed species, and protect them all in kind of it's a way to focus resources in a way that's not trying to protect the whole of Australia or the whole of all the remnant vegetation in Australia, which would be ideal, but not probably feasible. So yeah, I think that it offers a kind of a way around these problems that we have.
Yes, agreed. And this is something that Invertebrates Australia is one of our biggest priorities, is trying to understand where these important invertebrate areas are, how they relate to protected areas and currently unprotected areas. There's a fantastic paper out by some of our colleagues at the University of Queensland, Michelle Ward and James Watson recently, that shows that roughly half of Australia's critically endangered species are not inside any protected areas. They're way outside protected areas, and they're critically endangered, which means they're at the absolute highest level of threatened with extinction. And guess what? I think absolutely all of them, or very close to all of them, were invertebrates. James, would you like to speak to the red list of ecosystems, just to give people a bit of an idea about how ecosystems are assessed for their status? I think what they talk about with ecosystems is rather extinction, it's collapse, and whether the ecosystems are about to collapse.
Yeah, it's to be honest, it's not actually something I know a huge amount about. Um,
That's
I
okay.
think it's I've always focused more on the species side of things. I would like to
It's
be a
only
bit
very new,
better
isn't it?
informed. It is
Cool.
much newer. But yeah, my understanding of it is that it's a similar structure in that you've got these criteria. But yeah, as you said, it's not so much about an extinction of something. It's about the whole system collapsing. But yeah, to be honest, it's not something that I know a lot about.
That's okay. But it's cool for folks to know that David Keith, from UNSW in Australia, was one of the instrumental scientists in developing those criteria, and he's a wonderful conservation practitioner in Australia. So we're very
Mm.
we yeah we can be influential.
Yeah. Oh, David Keith is extremely influential. Yeah. I saw there was a question from Charlotte Wright about genetic data
Mm.
feeding into assessments, and the the kind of simple answer is that it is, but it's a bit complicated, because there's a few different parts of the red list where you can use genetic data, and obviously for some species you're not going to have much genetic data, but for me, one of the places it can be useful is when you've got quite small population sizes. You can show that you've got a risk of genetic bottlenecks and that kind of thing. And very small population sizes, very little genetic diversity, means you might be more at risk of disease and things like that. So that's one place that you're using genetic data. But yeah, it's sometimes used as a way of showing how different subpopulations are isolated and that kind of thing. So it is used, but it depends quite a lot on the taxonomic group, because for some things it's kind of more useful than others.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jane. I wanted to pick up on Alan's question in the Q&A around the role of ANIC in this. So for those of you not aware, ANIC is the Australian National Insect Collection, which is housed in Canberra in the CSIRO facility there at Black Mountain. And they just moved into a shiny, fancy new building. It's all very exciting. And this is essentially where the largest collection of insects is held in the country. I believe it's the largest. The role of ANIC, I think, is like, even more valuable than ever. It's, these repositories of species that have been collected over sometimes centuries, not so much in Australia, but certainly overseas, provide us an opportunity to look back in time using pretty cool, fancy genetics and isotopes and all kinds of things that you can use on museum specimens these days, to ask questions about how things were relative to how things are now. So they're super important, but ANIC's role is really about being a repository and curating the specimens, as opposed to doing the conservation work themselves. But they certainly facilitate really important conservation questions to be answered. And Jess, as a taxonomist, probably has some other things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, museums and herbaria collections in Australia or globally are vitally important for understanding our biodiversity as a record of what we've had. And as Kate mentioned, that looking back at so historic collections that were made in species that may have already gone extinct. They provide these mechanisms for holding specimens that provides almost like a footprint of our human impact in a way that we can measure it. It's one thing as a taxonomist. I use museum collections a lot for in taxonomy. They're vital. It's one question as a taxonomist is quite a difficult one to, or not taxonomist, as a conservation biologist, it's quite a difficult one to kind of internalize is, when you're collecting specimens for taxonomy, when you're working with museum specimens, they're all animals that have died. Most invertebrate species, you need to examine them under, sometimes dissect them under microscopes in order to get species level identification. And when the taxa that you are working on, the species you're working on are at risk from extinction and you believe that they are imperiled, it is a really difficult call to make. And the justification I use if I am describing a species based on samples that is in that situation is that really species need to be described. We need to know what a species is in order to understand more about it and in order for it to be assessed under the red list. But I think, so in terms of museum collections and in terms of taxonomy and species collection, it is really important, but it does raise some difficult questions, but also questions that it's really important to address and be honest about and be like, yeah, okay, if I take that specimen to be put into a museum collection as a record of that species, then I need to fully weigh up the cost and benefits of that and be open with that. But yeah, it's an interesting debate, I think, that whole one.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Jess. And actually, no, the public, as far as I understand, the collection is not open to the public, except for the occasional open day or something like that. So it's very, very much a research collection. Doug's got a question around listing threatened and or endangered under state legislation that confers legal protection, but how do the red list assessments and red listing connect to legislative protection in Australia? So that's an easy one to answer. The IUCN red list
doesn't.
The IUCN red list has provides no legislative protection for species in Australia whatsoever. And when species are listed on the EBPC Act, that is the Commonwealth Act, or any of the States Act, they in theory have legal protection. The great question for a conservation biologist is which one is more impactful in terms of, or which ones are more impactful in terms of getting public support, in terms of making sure that species are widely recognized, and which ones are most amenable to the kinds of data that you can collect on invertebrates. So the red list assessment, one thing we haven't kind of said that I think is important to pick up on is that the red list assessment criteria are the same criteria that are used by the Commonwealth and by New South Wales and some of the other states, but I'm not clear on which. In this really interesting, kind of geeky, interesting thing called the Common Assessment Method, where different governments in Australia have said, yeah, okay, we're all going to use the same criteria to assess our species for their extinction risk, which is really cool. And it's not really done many other places. In the US, it's not like that, so on and so forth. So endangered means very different things in different places, but that's the short answer to your question, Doug. All right, so we might move on to some of our questions that we got when people signed up for the webinar. And if you do have questions as we go, please do type them into the Q&A box. So there's a little Q&A box with a question mark in it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on that, it'll open a little box and you can type your question in. The first thing I suppose that we might jump into is a rather tricky one. So there was some really good questions and questions that we wrestle with all the time in conservation biology. So one of them was, how are there dozens of highly toxic pesticides widely used in Australia that are banned in other countries? That's a great question. Most of us would like to understand fully why that's possible too. And the short answer, which is all we have time to give really, is that the body that regulates the use of pesticides in Australia doesn't have enough data on the effects of those pesticides causing insect decline in Australia to say that they are to ban them essentially. In the US, nicotinoids and those sorts of pesticides, have been banned, and then they're questioned. And the tests for whether or not they're harmful come from all kinds of places, like whether or not they show up in honey and whether they can affect people. So there's a whole range of interesting kind of problems around that. But that's the short answer there. Jess, would you like to take one? I know we've had to prepare because we can't be experts on everything. Do you want to jump in and grab one of the webinar questions and answer it?
Sure, I'll just.
I can do another one if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a question about whether a genus can be protected. So it says few isopods are described, many are highly localized, species protection of them is extremely rare. And this is a really good question, and again, one that that we put a lot of thought into as conservation biologists. But in the short answer, a genus, as far as I'm aware, and James, I'd like your thoughts on this too, a genus can't be protected, that in terms of threatened species listings, that the unit that's worked on with threatened species is the species or subspecies level. Now, I know for taxa that I work on, where you've got a genus with many undescribed species or even few undescribed species, but species that you believe are likely at risk, it can be really frustrating, and especially when very few of that group are listed anyway. I don't know if there are any isopods listed under. I'd have to check.
See if I can check in real time.
But yeah, so in the short, currently based on species level protection, genus can't be listed, but what we can do, as we've spoken about, is protect habitat and look at ecosystem level protection for groups of concern. It's for invertebrates, as we've mentioned, with so many undescribed species and so many gaps in the data, it doesn't feel a satisfactory answer or response or even way forward for invertebrate conservation. And so I really do hope moving forward that questions like that are asked more broadly, and I'd love to have more discussions on how we can move forward. How can we meaningfully protect Australia's invertebrates? It's a huge question, a really interesting one.
We have 18 isopods listed.
Oh, wow.
That is amazing.
Well, in the isopoda. In the isopoda.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly for the global red list, we only really talk about assessments at the species scale. Sometimes the subspecies, that kind of thing, but we're generally talking at the species. In terms of your legislation under the EPBC Act or the state level legislation, I'm not aware of being able to list something at the genus level, but I don't know all the details. It might be possible.
No, I'm pretty sure with EPBC it's similar species or subspecies. Yeah.
We had a question about backyard beekeeping. So we had a question about whether or not we should discourage people from keeping bees, honeybees, European honeybees, because they're of course not native to Australia. And there is some evidence, but not a lot of evidence, that they compete with our native bees for resources. Our answer to that is that we encourage people to plant native plants, plant lots of flowers, and enjoy our wild bees. That would be our number one, kind of gold standard of loving bees in your backyard. And then the second kind of tier, I suppose, is if you really, really wanted to keep bees, then we would suggest keeping native bees rather than keeping honeybees. That would be our approach. As an invertebrate conservation organization, this is what we would encourage. Speaking of bees, so I'm a grasshopper and moth person. Jess is working on spiders and other cave invertebrates, and we had a great question about bees. So we were like, oh my God, let's find out more about our bees. So Jess, do you want to jump into that bee question? That was an excellent question.
Yeah, so we had a question that said, can you tell us more about native bees listed as threatened in New South Wales? And so we did some digging. So as far as I can see, there are currently 3 bees that are listed under the federal EPBC Act. None of those are found in New South Wales. And there are no bees listed under New South Wales state legislation. But there are 7 bees listed under the IUCN Red List. And we believe that most of those are found or also occur in New South Wales, as far as we can tell. As you can tell with these threatened species listings of different state, federal, and IUCN Red Lists, it sometimes can be a juggling act to get all the data together and work out what's happening where. But yeah, so
Of its own, yeah.
yeah. So I did find out there are around 200 native bees in the Sydney area.
Which is so cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's a lot. So yeah, so in terms of native bees in threatened native bees in New South Wales, yeah, there are 7 under the IUCN Red List. Is I think.
And I'm just going to put in, like, if you want, you can go and you can find this, like you can download these giant lists from the Commonwealth, yeah, I'm just putting a link in where you can go and you can dig through and you can find, and you can kind of create your own, you can play along at home and create your own kind of threatened species lists. But it is a job just pulling all this stuff together, and there's 12 different places that things could be listed, and they could be listed at different levels, and the data on where they are is changing all the time, and the level that they're listed at is changing all the time. So these things are really dynamic, these lists. They're not static. And and it's not easy to just kind of immediately say, oh, this is, that or this. So it is a bit tricky. I was just looking at a question from Anthony around invertebrate decline being well documented elsewhere, but seems to be a lack of data from Australia. Yeah, I mean, certainly we've done quite a poor job of documenting our biodiversity in terms of the investment that, the Australian government has put into Western science. And of course, with colonization, knowledge was destroyed. Indigenous knowledge was destroyed on a huge scale. So we've both lost this incredible richness of Indigenous knowledge in Australia from millennia of occupation, and and working with and being part of the landscape, and simultaneously have done quite a bad job of investing in it. So yes, certainly we don't have great data on insect decline in Australia, but we do have a lot of really interesting ways to document things nonetheless. So for our Christmas beetle count, for example, we're asking people about their memories of where they saw Christmas beetles and when there were lots of Christmas beetles around. People have noticed that things are conspicuously absent, and of course, these sorts of anecdotal observations are not science. They're not scientific, and they can be incorrect. And so we want to try to collect data in a rigorous way, albeit people's memories is still a way to, social scientists have all the answers. You can still collect those kinds of data in a rigorous way and try to reconstruct some of these past distributions and abundances. All right. What else have we got on our list here? So look, I think the main thing that we really wanted people to come away from this webinar with is a sense of, there's lots of work to be done, but there's also an incredible amount we can do. So there's a few people asking, how can we help, and what can sort of average folks do? There is a ton of things people can do, and they're fun. The wonderful thing about invertebrate conservation is that everyone can get involved. You can have a balcony garden. You can go down to your local park, your local patch, and you can record what you find. You can find invertebrates right outside your front door in almost all cases. So it's a really easy conservation practice to be part of. So the main things we always suggest to folks are to plant flowering plants, native plants, recreate habitat that's been destroyed by, so many different processes, but including just on the local scale by our lawns and things like that. Rip up half your lawn and stick a bunch of flowers in there, and check out what comes along. Provide water and all those sorts of things. But another really important thing you can do is make sure that you're not spilling light out into your garden when you don't need to. So closing your curtains or turning off outdoor lights when it's appropriate to do so allows nocturnal creatures to get on with what they've got to get on with. Spiders building their beautiful webs outside. I always think of Charlotte's Web building her little web at night for Wilbur in the corner of her barn and all those sorts of things. These kinds of really simple things can. And then you can do some astronomy, however that works. Look at some planets. I don't know. You need a different kind of scientist for that one. But there's lovely things that you can do that really enrich your life as well as enriching the places around you. Of course, not spraying pesticides is a very obvious one, something we can just stop doing that makes things much, much better. Jess or James, do you want to jump in with other suggestions there or other things that people can do to help?
Yeah, I think with the invertebrates, I think all of those things are really important. And I think keeping that positive, we can make things better. If you think about all of our individual green spaces, backyards, balconies, whatever we've got, individually, it's a small area, sort of little backyard. If we bring that all together and add together all the spaces that we collectively as humans have and have access to, then it's actually a really large area. So I think that's important. But I think really, as well as all that, we need to care. We need to kind of value what we've got. Invertebrates are wonderful. They're amazing. And I could spend hours just watching a little spider doing its thing. I think once we stop and take notice and look and observe and care for what we've got, then we can start building on all these great things and really kind of trying to prioritize invertebrates more or value them more in our life. I think for a lot of people, there is a disconnect. And I think building that connect back into nature, back into invertebrates it's important for us. And you also can get so much wonder out of it. They're amazing little things.
And our kids teach us this.
Yes.
And we teach us this when we've forgotten as cranky old grown-ups. And I think we're lucky to have little kiddos in our lives, to remind us of these things. But if we could remember by ourselves, that would be great. One thing you can do if you do have a garden that you don't use pesticides, you can sign our No Spray Spring pledge, where we're trying to collect the postcodes of folks and the size of the area they're protecting all around the country, so we can get people to help fill in the gaps so that we can create this network of of invertebrate safe places around Australia. So I've popped the link in the chat there. And if you're interested in volunteering for IA, I've also put a link in my answer to Aisling's question around volunteer opportunities. It's been fantastic to have you all come along tonight. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm always delighted to see so many people staying up late, or at least this is late for me with two little kids. Please consider us for an end of financial year donation at IA. We're trying to do all of this work to keep these little guys looked after, and we really appreciate many of you I know are supporters already and donors. So thank you very much for coming along. And do keep your eye out for more webinars and member events and things like that coming up throughout the year. We've got a big spring planned. It's all happening with new programs and things like that in partnership with why can't I think of their name? The Invasive Species Council. So lots of really exciting things coming up. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.